recently, I've been playing a lot of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, the video game based on a first edition adventure path. And it's got me thinking a little bit more about a certain game design principle within character advancement, which is found in Pathfinder 1st and 2nd edition, and specifically in how that's evolved between the two editions, as well as D&D 3.5. So a quick note here is I've only actually played, or more accurately ran, Pathfinder 2nd edition and D&D 3.5 with a couple of Pathfinder things pulled in. I had the books for 3.5 and do not for Pathfinder 1e. If my appearance is a little bit awkward in this video, that's because I'm referencing the physical 3.5 book, which I have to my side and on my lap. So to start here, I'm not expecting most people to have a lot of familiarity with both editions. Some of you might have played Pathfinder 1e, and some of you might not have played Pathfinder 2e. So I think I need to explain a little bit, starting with Pathfinder 1e, of how the classes worked before I can talk about certain special advancement methods. So in Wrath of the Righteous, there's really 2 or 3 different ways that a character can advance differently from what's called the base class. So in 1e, a base class is essentially a more generic class. There's a bunch of them here. This is Archetypes 1e. And the idea of a base class is it's supposed to be broader. In reality, it's drawn from 3.5, and some of the base classes of 3.5 are less broad than others. For example, I have the Paladin here, and you might note that its alignment restricted to lawful good, showing that it's not really as broad an archetype as some of the official content for 3.5 frames them as. And I suspect Pathfinder 1e might frame it similarly. But on the flip side, you have things like the Fighter, which can represent anyone who uses a weapon to attack. So that's the base class. Essentially, it gives you a certain progression chart shown here. This is shared with Pathfinder 2e, except the progression chart looks a little bit different. So I'll go over to the Pathfinder 2e page for Champion, the equivalent of Paladin. And you might notice there's fewer numbers within the class table. So in 1e, instead of having the just listing of various features, you have what's called a base attack bonus, a fortitude save, a reflex save, and a will save, as well as spells per day, all shoved into the one table. And special is any class features. So the idea here is in Pathfinder 2e, the difference is you get bonuses to saves based off proficiency, which is the same across all classes, just with a different proficiency rank per save. And that's given by specific class features in 2e, such as reflex expertise. In 1e, you have different progressions by class, and you also have the base attack bonus progression. So that's the number you get to your attack and your number of multi-attacks, whereas Pathfinder 2e has the free action system. So going from here, you can see that there's a bit of a numerical difference appearing, and from there, it kind of influenced the ways that progression is shown. In Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, there's really 3 methods of advancement, as I said before. First off, you have the base class progression, and you can also modify base classes, such as over here under Archetypes for the Paladin, you could have a different class on top of it. It works the same with the tabletop in the video game here. So for instance, you could have a Warrior of the Holy Light instead of the Paladin, and the progression table is the same except for where noted. So for Warrior of the Holy Light, you have the same save progression and base attack bonus progression. But then over here, you can see that certain features are replaced, such as down here, Warrior of the Holy Light. It shows first what you are replacing by taking this. So you lose spellcasting and the Aura of Faith, and you get to replace it with the Power of Faith ability. And that type of level up generally just works like in Pathfinder 2e, you just gain what's listed. You're not picking feats in first edition. And that's actually the big difference in progression. But there are two other ways you can progress in Wrath of the Righteous and first edition. One of them I'm not really going to be talking about because that's the Mythic advancement system, which is a bit different from what I'm focusing on. It is also present in 2e, but in a different form, and I'm not super familiar with it aside from the video game. The other way that you can advance that's a little bit different is what's called a prestige class. So the idea is a prestige class is something that a lot of characters take as they get higher in level to add additional features. It's usually includes some prerequisites that make it so you have to be a certain level, such as here is the Mystic Sarouge. I also have the 3.5 version open in my book. And there's some alignment restrictions in Pathfinder which are not present in 3.5. But otherwise, the requirements you can see on the screen, which are Knowledge Arcana, free ranks, and Knowledge Religion, free ranks. And then second level Divine and Arcane spells. So this means that to become a Mystic Sarouge, you have to be a 6th level character with 3 levels of Wizard and 3 levels of Cleric. Or if you're going the spontaneous route, the equivalent would be 4 levels of Sorcerer and 4 levels of Oracle. Either works. And from there, there's a couple more little 3.5 isms that I might need to explain. First off is the ranks. Pathfinder 2e simplified this to just having 4 ranks for every skill. You have a proficiency rank in that skill. So you can be trained, expert, master, or legendary in every skill. The way it worked in Pathfinder 1e and D&D 3.5 is you get a certain number of skill points per level, such as in the Paladin class, you can see right here, you get 2 plus intelligence modifier skills per level. And those skill points can be distributed across all of the skills present. And there's a fair number of them. The specific number varies between the two systems because Pathfinder 1e squished together a couple of 3.5e skills. But in general, you just have that certain number of ranks per level, and you distributed your skill points across them. So you could put free into Knowledge Arcana or free into Trickery, and it would be the same type of thing. There's a limit on the number of skill points you can put into a skill based off your level, which is also present in Pathfinder 2e with a maximum proficiency rank in any skill, but it's a little bit more complex of a calculation in 3.5. Then you might have noticed I also said different levels based off spontaneous and prepared spellcasters. So the reason that that comes up is because in D&D 3.5, you had different spell progression based off the class. So, for instance, I'm just pulling open the player's handbook here for that edition, and I'll use the Wizard and Sorcerer as examples here. So, I'll start with the Sorcerer. Basically, in the Sorcerer's spell table, which you could see by, like right here, you can see a spells per day table. I'm looking at about the same thing, just on paper. And the Sorcerer starts out with 1 more spell slot than the Wizard, although they have only a list of known spells. Then, at 3rd level, when the Wizard gets their 2nd level spells, which at that point they have 1 2nd level spell slot and 2 1st level spell slots, the Sorcerer, at the exact same time, has 5 1st level spell slots. Spontaneous spellcasters unlocked the next spell rank a level later than prepared spellcasters, although in exchange they got far more slots. So that's coming up with this requirement, meaning that if you're a spontaneous spellcaster, you have to be a different level than if you're not. So that means people entering this prestige class could be entering at different levels based off when they got the requirement. And that's kind of the assumption with the whole taking levels of a prestige class or class, instead of Pathfinder 2e system where you just have levels of your class and then you modify it. I'll talk about that a bit more near the end as I get into the 2e stuff. So continuing here with the first edition and 3.5 prestige class. There's basically two types of them that appear to represent different situations. There's technically one more in 3.5, but I'll talk about the ones in both first. The first one is basically a generic prestige class. This is the type of thing that the vast majority of characters are going to end up taking. Some characters will go straight to level 20 in their class, but that's not always the case. The Mystic Serrouge is an example of this more generic type. While there is an alignment thing, there's no flavor requirements to become a Mystic Serrouge. Anyone with the required spell ranks and skill ranks can become one. That's different from the other type, which is a, you could say, flavor-based prestige class, such as the Hell Knight, or the required prerequisites for Hell Knight in other versions of it. So essentially, the Mystic Serrouge just adds on to what you already have. The way that works is every rank of Mystic Serrouge, you get +1 level of your existing arcane and +1 level of your divine spellcasting class. So that means that you have second level spells to begin with. As long as you're a prepared spellcaster, you will then get another level, and you will unlock third rank spells at level 8 in both classes, which means that you basically have additional spell slots over anyone else. However, the disadvantage of Mystic Serrouge, which frequently comes up when people talk about it in online spaces, is that you don't actually get to level 20 with it. Most of the end game prestige classes get you to 20th level, or they're in a certain number of levels. The assumption is with 3.5 and 1e, you're doing a character build path, which essentially is gradually mixing and matching different class levels to get an end result. That means that sometimes your character might not come online. For instance, to become a Mystic Serrouge, you're kind of weakening yourself up to 6th level, when usually you should have 3rd rank spells, by only having 2nd rank spells. But in exchange, you have both arcane and divine spellcasting, which basically means you have almost every spell in the game. So there's a trade-off, and that's how builds work. That is different from 2e's kind of philosophy here, which is that you do not have bad levels per se due to how you're building. You might have to take multiple feats to get your abilities online, but in general, you're not having to trade off base power, like your spell progression, to get other abilities, because every class has feats. One thing to show here is, for instance, if I click on the wizard, it might be a little different in 1e. Again, I'm more familiar with 3.5. So yeah, it's a little bit different, but you can see that at most levels, the wizard doesn't get a class feature, which is different from Pathfinder 2e, where every other level, the wizard does get a class feat, meaning that you're essentially, it's illustrating why prestige classes appear. I'm trying to explain this as best I can, but basically in 3.5e, the way that people view it is the wizard doesn't get any special features. It's literally just getting spell progression and bonus progression. So if you're looking at that, after a certain point, you want to go for a prestige class, like Mystic Serrouge. Or there's other examples, like some might go for a Archmage. which gives you your same bonus of spellcasting level, which in 3.5 you almost never want to trade it off. Spells are too powerful. But you get that, and then you also get other stuff. The Sarouge isn't the best example of this, but other classes, for instance, would give you special abilities on top of your features. However, this is illustrating the kind of big trade-off of the system, which is imbalance. This is something that Pathfinder 2nd edition tried very hard to remedy. Basically, in 3.5e, spellcasting is king. It's more powerful than anything else, especially for full prepared casters, because the spells themselves are far more powerful. For instance, there's a spell called Permanency, which essentially allows you to make one spell effect permanent on a character. So, upon hearing that, it might not sound that broken, per se, but if you think about it a little bit more, a lot of this system is buff stacking. It's very obvious when you're playing Wrath of the Righteous, and very obvious at the table. So, for instance, in D&D 3.5, which I have, again, the book, you have the Bless spell, which is a first level spell. It's available to clerics and paladins, as well as some other classes if you add in the full rule set. So its effect is it gives each ally a +1 morale bonus on attack rolls and saving throws against fear effects. It counters and dispels Bane. So in and of itself, a +1 doesn't sound that big. Like, if you're familiar with 2e, you know it is actually fairly big. But it's actually smaller in 3.5. It's just you can stack far more of them in 3.5. Basically, there's more types of bonuses. So you can have a very large plus by stacking different types of bonuses. So you have the morale bonus, but then you also have item bonuses and ability score bonuses and several other types that will go on top of each other to create a stronger result. Pathfinder 2e tamps down on this by limiting it to a total of 3 types: circumstance, item, and I always forget what the third type's called, but it's essentially like your Bless and Bane spells. You can also have fortune effects, but they're very rare in 2e, whereas they're not so rare in Pathfinder 1st edition or D&D 3.5. So where I'm going with this is essentially the spells are more powerful than everything else, which by comparison can make martial characters relatively weak. Because in addition to not having spellcasting, if you go a straight martial character, you also have fewer skill ranks, which means you can do less with it. That's why you have what's called class tier lists. I'm not going to go into it right now, but essentially the way it works is with both games, if you go onto online forums, there are people analyzing the system in terms of how equal the classes are in power. For example, it tends to put the strongest classes in tier 0, and then tier 1 is below that, tier 2 is below that, etc. And the basic summary of how this tends to work out for pretty much everyone is tier 0 is the truly busted class. It's not super common, but there is 1 or 2 in 3.5 which tend to get tossed in that rank. Then below that are the classes with all the spellcasting they could want. These are prepared spellcasters who have access to basically any spell. And additionally, the number of spells they have is far higher because they can cast any spell off their list that they can learn. And the number of spells for each slot increases as you level. So at maximum rank in 3.5, you have the maximum number of spells at every single rank. Whereas if I would go over to Pathfinder 2e here, up at the top, and click on the wizard, you can see here that their spell progression does not give you the maximum rank of the highest rank of spells. And there's only 9 spell ranks in Pathfinder 1st edition, whereas Pathfinder 2nd adds 1 more. But you also might notice that the total number of spells of each level is only 3. And that's at a 20th level character. In 3.5e, that's a little bit different. Because if you're a wizard, you have 4 spells per day of every single level. The spells are more powerful. And you also get additional spells based off your intelligence bonus. So that stacks up to far more spells. And on top of that, the other change here that makes it so that prestige classes are especially tempting is because your spells are heightened based off your level of spellcasting class. And that's actually why Mystic Theurge can be fairly powerful. To demonstrate here, think about a character taking Mystic Theurge at level 6. A level 3 cleric, level 3 wizard. So at that point, they just take the class and begin progressing in it. What happens is, at 8th level, they get 3rd level spells, which are then cast as a caster of 5th level in both classes. So in Pathfinder 2e, the spell level is determined based off the spell slot. So if you cast Heal in your 2nd level slot, for example, then it's heightened to 2nd level. In 3.5, the way that worked is if you cast Heal in your 1st level slot at level 3, it's heightened to 2nd level, because it's based off caster level, not your level. So that's why it's tempting for spellcasters. But then, at the same time, prestige classes are also aimed for by non-caster classes, because it gives you more options than the class itself would. For example, the fighter in 3.5 literally just gives you a feat every other level, as well as full base attack bonus, and a not high number of skill points. So as you can see, compared to the caster, that's not especially powerful or tempting. So if you want more than that, what do you have to do? Well, you can go for a martial archetype. For instance, the Hell Knight here. So the requirement to become a Hell Knight is first you must have a base attack bonus of +5. The only way you can get that is by going a pure martial class for 5 levels. Or you can multi-class between different martial classes. For instance, you could do a fighter and a barbarian and still end up with that bonus. But you have to do full-on martial. Or you have to enter at a higher level. Second, it requires proficiency in heavy armor, which is pretty much given by most of the classes that would want to be entering it. And since this is a flavor one, there's some required skills, namely knowledge planes, which would normally be taken by a martial character, and then special. It says a character must slay a devil with hit dice greater than his character level. This victory must be witnessed by a Hell Knight. So if you're thinking about this in terms of 2e, you're probably looking at the best way to think of it, if you're familiar with 2e, is essentially if you have a character planning to become a Hell Knight, the 5th level fighter would probably be equivalent to basically think of a 3rd level fighter versus a demon, which is 1 level higher than him. So it's a very tough fight to win, because hit dice greater than character level means that it's a little bit more powerful. But the other thing to consider is that there's challenge rating in Pathfinder 1e, not level per se. And it's not always the cleanest system. But what happens is basically a monster with the same number of hit dice tends to be considered a moderate challenge for a character of that level, because of some weird calculation I'm not particularly good with explaining, but it essentially just works out to a tough fight. But then, once a character becomes a Hell Knight, they have more abilities than they would as a fighter. For instance, their base attack bonus continues increasing at the same pace. This is crucial. It means they still have the same thing they would have gotten if they were a fighter. Additionally, they get other abilities, which work out to be quite powerful. For instance, you get Aura of Law, which lets you cast similar to a cleric, which by default a straight martial wouldn't have. Then it also gives you Detect Chaos and a Hell Knight Order and Smite Chaos and more. Whereas if you were going straight fighter, you're basically just getting a feat every other level. So that's why prestige classes are kind of assumed as the default, with the idea being your base class is filling in. At this point, I'm going to move over to talking about 2e specifically and how it adjusted this version of the system. Okay, so now that I've taken a drink there, I'll start looking at 2e. So I've been talking about 1e, which is based around having a base class and then going for prestige classes. In 2e, there's no such thing as a base class. You just have your class, and then you advance in that class. And you have as much variety as a character with prestige classes without having the whole prestige class thing, because you get feats from your class, not a general feat. The other thing with 3.5 that's coming into play here is that every single feat in the game, it's basically just tossed on one giant list with a bunch of required prerequisites. And some of them are literal traps. That doesn't happen in 2e, and it's explicitly against the design philosophy. 2e's aiming to make it so that most of the classes are similar power level when played well. That can result in some of the more difficult to play classes coming across as weaker to someone without the experience in them. However, in the end, your champion, your fighter, and your wizard are going to be on an equal playing field, whereas in 3.5, the wizard would be way above the other two. The way it does this is, first off, it restricts single target damage to martials and a couple of caster-like characters, rather than letting spellcasters do it. And second, the biggest shift is probably the spellcasting based on spell slot, not your own level, which works out to making spells significantly less powerful, which brings it more in line with martial abilities. Then, because they took away the prestige class thing, it's easier to guarantee an equal standard of power. Because if you're looking at 1e, you can go here to the prestige classes, and you can see there is a large number of them. It's very hard to balance that many options. Whereas if you're just balancing each class internally, you just have that class to look at. And it works out to being the same variety because of class feats, which if I go over here to champion feats, for example, you can see a large number of options which are given based off your own choice, and you get them about every other level. Some of them have prerequisites, like if you were going to be doing a prestige class, because, for example, this champion thing would have been in first edition a prestige class for certain abilities, such as the desecration cause being represented by a certain prestige class. But it's just represented by feats from the class and causes, which are kind of similar to the variant classes in first edition. However, they work more accurately by just adding on top of the class chassis rather than replacing. So that's the other differentiation. Basically, each class has a set of core abilities which are never replaced, whereas in 1e, they're frequently replaced by different modifications of the base classes. And from there, you have these base classes. But there is an additional way to modify the character, which is more similar to the prestige class system. And that's archetypes, and then special class archetypes. For instance, you could look here at the Avenger. It's one of the newer archetypes released with War of Immortals, one of the most recent books released by Pathfinder 2e. So the Avenger archetype is an archetype, meaning that it replaces your class feats. So, for instance, you could have a champion who, instead of taking a champion feat at 2nd level, decides to become, say, taking wizard archetype. Then you get the features from having taken the wizard archetype. Kind of similar to the replacing the base chassis. However, the Avenger is similar to that, but it also takes the subclass slot. That's why I'm calling it a special class archetype rather than an archetype in general, because one of the required entry points is you have to be a rogue. Then there's the adjustments applied. And at higher levels, when you scroll down, you have the feats on top of your rogue feats. So you can take from either list. If you want to take another archetype, you do have to take at least 2 feats within the one, which means that your Avenger Rogue can only take the feats from another archetype at a higher level. But you still get certain benefits, which otherwise you wouldn't, and it lets you represent a character which you otherwise wouldn't be able to. On the flip side, you have the more generic archetypes, which essentially let you add on top. And I think I'll finish up here with one last part of this comparison, which is essentially, since I have been talking about this Mystic Therouge a lot, how would you be able to create the same character in Pathfinder? So, to be clear here, the character will be less powerful in Pathfinder, but it will still have the same basic flair. You just have to choose, do you want your core to be a divine spellcaster, or do you want it to be an arcane spellcaster, rather than equally progressing in both? So if you wanted to, say, be mainly an arcane spellcaster, you could just take the wizard class. Then, at 2nd level, you go with an archetype, over here, such as cleric. And instead of giving levels in the cleric class, you have cleric feats that you can take instead of your wizard feats. For instance, you can gain spell slots for the cleric archetype, although far fewer than you have as a wizard. But that represents the same character without creating a explicitly stronger character. Whereas in 3.5e, combining frequently resulted in additional strength due to the specific way that spell leveling worked. I hope this was interesting for everyone. I was mostly just talking through how I think about this because I do run both systems from time to time. And I hope it gave you a view of how the systems vary. And if you've been thinking about trying Pathfinder 2e but didn't like 1e, this should demonstrate why it can feel much better to people who had that reaction. Thank you for watching.